This is David Ranson, and welcome to our webcast originally produced in the month of November 2025 and now reaching completion in December. And the topic is the progressive income tax from a somewhat different point of view than we hear mostly about it. But we're focusing mainly on the highly progressive, the very high rates of tax in the system. The first exhibit I want to show you is a picture of the history of the income tax back to nearly the beginning of the 1900s. And we see here we have a top rate according to the Bradford Tax Institute. Estimates of the top rate vary from source to source, but these they have different rules that they can follow, but this will do quite well. And you'll see there's also a median rate that I've computed from the history, and of course there's always a lowest rate as well. And what you can see in this graph, a very important point about this graph, is the parallel nature of the correspondence between the top rate and the median rate. Notice how the top rate goes up at the same time that the median rate goes up, and down at the same time that the median rate goes down. Of course, it's not exact, and there may be exceptions, but this shows a pretty broad parallel between the highest income tax rates that anyone in the progressive structure pays and the median, which is more typical of still quite high income investors. And that's going to be important because the income tax is so very complicated. We can't estimate its effects on the economy if we take into account each and every single different tax rate that different individuals with different incomes may face. I'm going to use the top rate as a proxy for all the rates in the income tax. It doesn't matter so much that it doesn't parallel the lowest rate all the time, because the lowest rate doesn't bring in an awful lot of revenue. But the parallel between the top rate and the median rate is close enough to allow us to use the top rate as a simplified indicator of the height of rates in the whole system. Now, how about the effect of changes in the top income tax rate on real GDP? It makes the calculation really very simple. We look over a 1 or 2 year period, and we find it takes 2 years after the tax rate change has gone into effect to have an effect on GDP, but it's pretty clear that the effect is to raise GDP growth relative to no change in the tax rate if the tax rate is cut, and to lower it if the tax rate is increased. And we see that in the highest and the lowest lines on this diagram. And we see the magnitude is quite significant. Over a 2 year period, it makes a difference between a cut and an increase in the tax rates of about 2 percentage points in real GDP, which is 1% per annum. That's quite material. Notice that the average tax rate change, if the tax rate is cut, historically has been 7%, and 10% when the tax rate is increased. So something in that area of 7 to 10% change in tax rates corresponds to a 2% difference in GDP over a 2 year period. In the following graph, Exhibit 3, we see the stock market's response to top tax rate periods, top tax rate movements rather. And this is more complicated, unexpectedly complicated perhaps. In the first 2 years, we have a correspondence between tax cuts and tax increases and the stock market's performance that looks very much like the real GDP performance. Of course, the numbers are different, quite a bit larger. But there are longer lags, not immediately visible or obvious, But if you allow for the a change in the top tax rate to still be influencing the stock market after 3 or 4 years, you get the results shown here. The market goes higher and higher. The spread between the different lines for a tax cut and a tax increase widen all the way up to about 4 years, after which they stabilize. The following chart shows the bond market's response to top tax rate movements. This is something I have not worked on as much as I have on the GDP or the stock market. But you see here now the opposite phenomenon, in which a cut in the tax top rate increases the bond market, and an increase in the top rate reduces the bond market. In the following chart, we see the top tax rate impact on real family income. The reason I'm interested in real family income, I go beyond GDP to look at this, is because we can measure the real family income of a lot of different income groups. And one of the most important questions to ask about the income tax is to what extent it meets its purpose of defending or protecting lower income groups against taxation by having much higher rates on the rich. At any rate, here is the effect on real family income, and it is parallel to what we saw with GDP. We see a cut in the top tax rate increases income, and an increase in the top tax rate reduces income. Again, it's over a 2-year period. There isn't very much to speak about after 2 years have gone by. But this is the starting point for calculating what might happen with the distribution of income when we change the top tax rate. The following slide shows a couple of quotations. I'll read these briefly, concerning the progressivity of the income tax system. Some say the tax system is not progressive enough. Others believe that the burdens at the top of the income scale, which are mainly due to the taxes on property income, are too heavy. But there is a consensus in favor of at least some progression in the overall tax burden. And that appeared many years ago, 50 years ago almost, in a book by Joseph Peckman, who at the time was probably the leading expert on tax policy in the US government. Another quotation comes from Joel Simrod in the Fortune Encyclopedia of Economics. I thought this was particularly good. He said, "The taxed burden, the hurt caused by taxes, is not borne entirely by the people who write the checks to the Internal Revenue Service. To some extent, many taxes are shifted to other members of society." Now, this is an issue that is not widely discussed, but it lies at the heart of the progressivity issue. Because if the taxes can be shifted to other parts of the population, then we can't be so sure that the rich really pay for the tax, thereby improving the distribution of income in favor of the poor. And that turns out to be a hinge issue in the work that I've done as well. In fact, the problem turns out to be much more serious than most people think, and more serious than I had thought for many, many years, until I looked very closely at the evidence. In the following slide, I show you the basis for looking at the evidence. It's just a diagram showing how uneven the distribution of income is. On the right-hand side, we have the aggregate income of 5 different income groups. It's pretty arbitrary where we draw the lines, and I don't have data to back this up, but it's just conceptual. We have the aggregate income of the richest group could be half of the entire aggregate income of the population. And then the next richest group may have half of that income, and the next, which I'm calling the middle income group, middling, that would have half again, and the poor half again, and finally the poorest half again. That gives you a ratio of 16:1 in the aggregate income of the richest people and the poorest people. Now, I'm not saying that this is the way our system is with any precision, but this is the kind of system we have with this very uneven distribution of income. And if we use simple numbers like this, we might be able to make some calculations. On the left, we have the number of families in each category. And of course, the fewest category, the smallest category, is the richest. The very ones who have the largest aggregate income are the ones where the number of families is smallest. And the poorest, the number of families is the largest, but collectively they have the lowest income, or the way I have set it up in this hypothetical calculation. Keeping that in mind, we can go on. The next point to make is that there are two ways to measure income. And it's without this, we really wouldn't have any way of judging with any accuracy at all how much redistributive impact there might be to the tax system. In other words, do the rich pay all of the tax, everything that they hand over to the federal government, the Internal Revenue Service, or do the rich change their behavior in response to tax rates, especially high tax rates, and that change in behavior is passed on as a cost to lower income groups? And I find the second possibility much more plausible, much more realistic. Well, the way to get at this is to have two different measures of family income, or real family income in this graph. As you see, we have a mean, which is just every dollar is treated the same, and the median, where we're treating every family as the same. And that, of course, gives an entirely different answer. The median family is much lower income than the family whose income is the mean. And as you can see that in this graph. Of course, they move in parallel. The whole point about the rich and the poor is that they're not independent groups of society. They work together, they produce things together. On the whole, the richer people have a tendency to have the means to employ poorer people. But that's an economic relationship. And if the richer people move away from the most productive possible uses of their capital, they will find fewer reasons to employ the lower income groups. That's at the heart of the issue. Can we measure that? Well, I have one estimate, one way of measuring it. There may be many others, but they're not easy to find, and work will continue on this for a long time to come. That's shown in the following graph. You'll see here two graphs similar to the one that we saw on GDP, and I also drew the real family income the same way. Basically, two lines on each graph. One is the average behavior of income resulting from a tax cut to the year before over a 2-year period, and the red line is what results from a tax rate increase. And of course, in the vast majority of years, there is no change in the top tax rate. So most years, maybe 60 or more years, are are excluded from the two lines in each of these graphs. But the lines do include years in which the top tax rate is changed, either up or down. So we see, as we did with GDP, a widening gap over a 2-year period between the effects of a tax rate cut and the effects of a tax rate increase. And once again, very important assumption, very highly simplifying assumption is that I use the top tax rate I don't need to, in my opinion, put a lot of weight on all the other tax brackets. The top tax rate will do the job, even though the top tax rate theoretically is only paid by the rich, certainly not paid by anyone less than a pretty high income. Nevertheless, if the rich affect the well-being of the poor through doing less business with the poor by employing them less or paying them lower wages or finding ways to cooperate with poor groups, low-income groups, all of those things cause the tax effect to shift. And although the poor may not pay any of the top tax rate, in fact, the poor obviously don't pay any of the top tax rate, whether it doesn't matter whether it's cut or increased from a formal legislative point of view, nevertheless, the behavior of the rich in response to a change in the top tax rate does cause them to change the way they deal with other parts of the population, and particularly with respect to the poorest income groups who are employed by them. So now what we see are two graphs. We're very lucky to have two graphs instead of one. We would not be able to tell anything about the distribution of income if we only had one graph. But we have one graph for median family income, that's real median family income, on the left, and we have a different graph for real mean family income. And they resemble each other, but they're not the same. They could be the same, which means that the tax the effect of a change in the top tax rate would be distributed evenly throughout the population. That would be what you would get if there were identical graphs on the left and the right of this chart. But if we push a little harder, and this may be going too far, but just in case, and we ask the question, where is the largest divergence between the effects of a tax rate increase and a tax rate cut? It's in the median family income on the left, rather than the mean family income on the right. And as I mentioned, the median family income has in its calculation very much more weight attached to lower income groups. So the fact that we have on the left a widening that is greater than the widening on the right is a symptom of at least the possibility that the taxes paid by the rich are shifted throughout the population to such an extent that the poor, on a proportionate basis, are hurt more than the rich are hurt. And that seems ridiculous, the very opposite of what our progressive income tax is meant to create. But it's quite realistic, because the rich have many, many ways to avoid taxes. They can hire lawyers to do really fancy things, and they can use their money for that purpose. The poor have no such outlets. The poor have to just put up with what happens to them. If they become unemployed, they just try to get another job, but they have no easy way to dodge the tax system if it comes at them through the economic system. So you have the paradox that the poor can end up de facto paying a higher proportion of their income in tax than the rich do as a result of a tax which falls directly in its legal incidence only on the very, very rich. And that's the startling answer that I obtained from this line of work up to this point. It may not be the end of the story. It's only the first sign that there may be something interesting along these lines to say, but much more evidence must be gathered. Unfortunately, the evidence gathering process is very voluminous and very arduous, and it'll take a long time. I'm very lucky that we have two simplifications. The use of the top tax rate and ignoring the lower rates is one of them, and the use of medians versus means is the other. And with those remarks, I undertake to do much more work on this in the future, and that's as far as I can provide a rationale or a narrative at this stage. Those are my remarks in this webcast. and I look forward to another webcast in maybe 3 months.